Episode 13 with Karl Vaters. Hey everybody, you're listening to the Never Forsaken podcast, looking at the lives of the outcasts, the seekers, the never forsakens, those in or out of the local church and passionate about Christ. The show is broadcast weekly, and show notes and more information can be found at neverforsakenpodcast.com. I'm your host, John Robinson. Let's get into the show. Thank you, podcast listeners, for tuning in to another episode of the Never Forsaken podcast. My guest today is Karl Vaters. He's the founder of New Small Church at newsmallchurch.com and lead pastor of Christian Cornerstone Fellowship in Fountain Valley, California. Karl, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, John.
Great to have you, Karl. Karl, when we're talking about churches and church growth, and that's going to kind of be the topic today, a lot of the perspective that I've gotten from people I've interviewed so far is a lot of outside looking in on the church and people dealing with their own personal experiences. And so this is going to be kind of the opposite, where you're on the inside of church and church ministry. And so hopefully you can share with us some of the inside looking out experience.
Sure.
Now, obviously, when we talk about churches, we don't necessarily mean buildings and denominations. We know that we're the body of Christ. We're focused on extending the love of Christ to the community around us. But that being said, we still do need to talk about churches and church ministry and church growth. So if you could talk a little bit about what it is that you're doing at New Small Church, and it seems that your ministry focus there is the small church. Now, what would you define, what constitutes a small church?
Yeah, well, for the ministry that I am doing with small churches, I specifically target churches of 200 and under. The average church in the world is about 75 people. So a typical person in a small church is typically in a church of about 40 or 50, so 200 sounds huge. But most church leadership research caps the small church at about 200, because once you go over 200, you have to have a completely different leadership style. You have to start delegating pastoral duties to others because there's just too many people to pastor. But 200 and under, the pastor does most of the pastoring. And so there's less difference between a church of 180 and 80 than there is a church of 180 and 300, let's say. Okay,
good. Makes sense. Yeah. So you cite some of the statistics on your website is that the small churches make up about 80 to 90% of the total churches, but it accounts for less than 1% of books and blogs about how to do church ministry. Why do you suppose this is, if that actually does represent the majority of churches?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. One, I want to, if I'm going to read a book, it's going to be a book by somebody who I know, somebody I'm aware of, somebody whose name I recognize, and there's not an awful lot of famous small church pastors out there. So right. The names are going to be the names of the people in big churches, and they're going to teach from a big church perspective. So I think that's one of the reasons. Secondly, pastors want their churches to grow. We want to reach more people for Jesus. And the assumption is, if my church is reaching more people for the Lord, then my church is going to be physically bigger. And so we look to those whose churches have grown numerically and think, oh, that's a sign that they're doing it right, and I want to learn from them. So I think that's the two primary reasons why almost all of the teaching is from a big church perspective and very little is from a small church perspective.
Do you think that focus on, this pastor or this writer is a famous person, is that a dangerous mindset to think about?
Yeah, it can become dangerous. I don't think it begins dangerously. I think it starts with name recognition. Mm-hmm. Right. So if I see a book, I see books on the shelves, and one's by Rick Warren and one's by Bill Hybels and the other one's by Karl Vaters and John Robinson. 9 out of 10 are going to pick up the Hybels and Warren books simply by name recognition. And that's just the way we are. We go with the people. We don't go by content as much as we go by trusting the author. And if I don't know the author, I can't trust the author. But if I know the author, then maybe I can. Or in some cases, because I know the author, I know I can't trust them, and that's a different issue for another day.
Sure. So, we're talking about church growth, and so do you think that now a lot of church growth, is that attributed to church hoppers or church seekers?
Yes and no. I think if you look at where mega churches are, for instance, in the world. And I've got no problem with mega churches. A lot of people worshiping Jesus is great. Whether they're all in one church or whether they're scattered over a bunch of churches, either way, the more people worshiping Jesus, the better. But if you look around the world and see the pockets, and there's only a few pockets where mega churches predominate, what you're going to find is that mega churches aren't happening in places where Christians are increasing as a percentage of the population. Mega churches are dominant where Christians have money. And where the church is growing as a percentage of the population, that is predominantly done through the multiplication of smaller churches and even house churches. So the idea of a lot of Christians getting together into big churches isn't necessarily a sign of the culture around them becoming more Christian. It doesn't mean they're not, but it isn't the thing that's driving that.
So does that become a problem for a small church pastor, as if he's dealing with churchgoers who are shopping his church, just checking it out, and he may see that he's experiencing a little bit of growth, but then he talks to the families and finds out, well, we used to go to this church and then we don't like it, we're going to check out your church. Does that shopping mentality present a problem for the small church pastor?
I think it's a problem for pastors, for churches of any size, because appealing to church shoppers will never build a great church. No matter, even if it builds a big church, it won't be a great church if it's appealing to church shoppers. If all we're doing is entertaining bored Christians, you can't build something great on that. So size, I don't think, has an issue, because I live in Orange County, California. Some people call it Mega Church Central, and it certainly it fits the bill for that. It's where it's where Saddleback Church is, the original Calvary Chapel, the original Vineyard, Crystal Cathedral. I mean, they're all within a half-hour drive of my front door. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy to look at it and remember the people who left my church to go to a big church. But what I have to remember is there are probably just as many people in my church who left a big church to come to my church. And neither one of those is building the kingdom. That's just trading sheepfolds. Mm-hmm. The biggest issue is, what's the percentage of people in my church who came to faith as a result of our church? And I don't think size changes that percentage much.
Right, that makes sense. So when you're talking about conversions, it seems like that might be a little bit, is it easier for the small church to focus on that? They can disciple a little bit better than the large church. My experience with the large church, I just came out of a mega church. My only reason for going there was after some years of kind of being burned out of church and burned out of ministry. I wanted to go somewhere where I wasn't known and where I wasn't going to be approached by somebody the same way I might in a small church. Sure. In other words, I could go into the mega church, do my thing, worship, hear the word, and I could leave, and nobody was going to try to grab me and be like, hey, you want to help out with the, such and such event? And
right.
It's time for me to move on, and it's time for me, I'm feeling, to get involved again. But anyway, my question is, it seems, though, that even with the small and the larger churches, it seems that a lot of it is geared towards the new person, and then not so much on rechurching the de-churched, which I read in one of your articles. So sometimes I feel like this is where a person like myself gets lost in the church experience, because I don't, I come into a church and I don't need to be taking that next step and visiting the information booth. So I tend to get, I think, lost after a little bit. Yeah.
I think there are different levels of difficulty depending on who you're reaching. I think maybe some of the hardest people to reach are disenfranchised believers, because if somebody's starting neutral, then they're neutral. They don't have the bad history. But when you're trying to reach disenfranchised believers who have been hurt by churches, who have been burned, you've got to fill in that hole before you even get them to level ground. Our church tends to do that well, not because we decided, hey, we're going to try the hard stuff, but because for whatever reason, God's gifted us to do that. And we discovered a few years ago, wow, we're doing this a lot. We are the place where hurting Christians show up to get healing. So now that we've discovered that, hey, we tend to do that well, now let's make that a part of our purpose, and let's do that on purpose. So that's on the difficult end of things. I think on the easiest end of things is to entertain bored Christians, to put on a better Christian show. So on either end, you've got believers. On the one end, repairing wounded saints, and on the other end, entertaining bored saints. And in the middle is the target audience we need to be reaching, which is brand new or non-believers, pre-churched, unchurched people, whatever phrase you want to use, and ministering to them with the gospel. And every church has to find their own niche. Every church has to discover what their purpose is. I don't think any church should exist for the purpose of entertaining bored Christians. That's for sure.
Yeah, I can agree with you on that.
Yeah, but on the other ones, I think healing wounded Christians is a valid thing. Obviously, bringing in new believers to the fold is a valid thing. But as you were suggesting a little earlier, we need to have a balance between reaching out to newcomers, but also training the disciples. Jesus said, "I will build my church." He didn't give that job to us. The job he gave to church leaders was equip the saints and make disciples. And if we're doing those in balance, then we've got a healthy church. A church that's just trying to put on a bigger Christian show and thinking that that's going to reach non-believers, I think is living in a little bit of self-deceit, because I don't know any unchurched people who wake up on Sunday morning and go, you know what, instead of watching the game today, I think I want to go to a building where I can sit in rows and watch a half-decent religious show, sing songs that I don't know, and hear a lecture from a person about a 2,000-year-old book. Yeah, that's what I feel like doing today.
It sounds appealing.
Yeah, right. So that's not what people are doing. People are drawn to the church almost exclusively, certainly primarily, by relationships.
Sure.
They know and like a Christian in their neighborhood, at work, in their family. And once they begin to know and like and trust them, and then usually through some kind of traumatic event in their life where they're having to think of things bigger than themselves, they go back to that person and say, accept that invitation to church. But the people who don't go to church don't want to go to church.
Right. No,
that's why they're people. The big mystery. It's not really a big mystery as to why people don't go to church. They don't go because they don't wanna.
Right.
That's the bottom line. And so we have to give them a reason to want to. And putting on a show isn't going to do it, because they got a better show on the cell phone in their pocket.
Sure. Well, that includes me too. I mean, as a disenfranchised Christian, it's funny because you talk about relationship, and I would have relationship with people and share the gospel, and then they would say, oh, if they seemed interested, it was like, well, where do you go to church? I really don't. So,
yeah.
I was kind of stuck in a place not to even be able to really bring anybody. But so in so-called church life, is the smaller church seen as somehow perhaps less successful than large or mega churches? Even though, if they're not in reality, but is in the church life and in conferences and whatnot that you go to, is that kind of the thing? Like, hi, I'm Pastor so-and-so, and I've got 200 people in my church. Does that kind of raise the eyebrows?
Yeah, that's the perception, and it's a problem that I fought even against my own self. I mean, I've been a small church pastor for 30 years, and I didn't know I was one until 5 years ago, because up until then I thought I was a big church pastor who just hadn't arrived yet. And the reason I thought that was I really thought small church was automatically failing, because when every conference you go to talks about how to make your church grow, well, if we've got to constantly make our church grow, then that must mean that smaller is worse and bigger is better.
Right.
Now, when you put it that way, virtually every church leader comes back and goes, no, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. But that is what comes across when it's a constant drumbeat of get bigger, get bigger, get bigger. So
right.
The perception is very real that that smaller is a problem. So, or even if you're plateaued at a certain number. Like we've been plateaued at about 200 in our church for a lot of years now. And so most people would look at that and go, well, then we got to figure out how to get you unstuck. But we're not stuck, right, because we're a sending church. We help heal wounded believers. That's one of the things we do. We also bring in brand new believers who've never had a relationship with Christ before. But the second thing we're really good at is training people, especially younger people, to go out into the ministry, into the mission field, sometimes as professional clergy, sometimes just simply as a better witness in their workplace. But we often lose people who leave our congregation because they've been called off to go into ministry in another place.
Sure.
So that's not the only thing. Sometimes they leave because they don't like me too. I mean, let's get real.
It happens, right?
But to a larger degree than most, I think, we are a sending church. So we're always having to replenish that pool of people just to maintain our current size. The numbers alone are not an indicator of health. If numbers are dropping, there's usually something we need to look at and ask ourselves, okay, is there something wrong here? Because they can be indicators of some things, but to assume too much from them is dangerous.
So when a small church gets, say you're at that plateau, and let's just say it's 200, and then you start to grow, and I mean, I was in a church that was stuck at 300 for years, and that was kind of the catchphrase the leadership would say, oh, we've been plateauing at 300 for 3 years, what do we need to do? They went out and built like a multi-million-dollar facility, and the church did double in size like within a year, went up to like 600-700 people. But of course with that is bigger expenses and whatnot. So did the church really grow in a way? Like right. I don't really think that was growth per se, just kind of building a bigger sheep shed, I guess. But so do you recommend then when church starts to get to that past that small stage, should they just continue to grow, or is church planting a better option?
Both and. It depends on the situation. I do think church planting is usually a better option if we can do so. But for some churches, growing bigger where they are is part of their option. For a lot of churches, doing both. There's a lot of churches that are physically growing bigger while they are planting other churches as well. I don't think there's one size fits all answer, which I think is one of the difficulties of a lot of how church growth has been taught in the last few decades. Is we've really only been given one model. We've been given the get bigger where you are model. And that's just not the only model out there. In fact, it's not the best model for a lot of churches. It's the best model for some, but it's not for a lot.
Well, because bigger is not necessarily healthier.
Right. And like you said earlier, a lot of people who go to bigger churches, they do so for many valid reasons, but sometimes they go because, as you were saying, it's easy to be anonymous. So the big churches have to fight this tendency to be gathering passive believers because they can be anonymous. On the small side, we have to fight the tendency for the control freaks who show up.
Sure.
Right? Because if you want to be in charge somewhere, small church, you can be in charge because every individual holds greater sway. So control freaks tend to show up at small churches. People who want to be anonymous tend to show up at big churches, and each size needs to fight those tendencies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So definitely a pastor's got to keep his eye on, on the health of his church. That's very important.
Yep.
So you sent me an article, Karl, on quirky churches, and I'd like to discuss that a little bit. So
sure. Since
church size isn't necessarily an indicator of church growth or success, what's the importance of the quirky church, or the importance of, your church finding its niche?
Yeah, Jesus told the parable of the 100 sheep and the shepherd who went out to find the one. Most church growth stuff concentrates on the 99. They even call it phrases like low-hanging fruit. But not everybody is called to reach the low-hanging fruit. Every individual matters, and some people are not living lives that most people in the neighborhood would consider typical. I like the word quirky because it doesn't carry a negative connotation necessarily.
Right.
It's different. It can be fun. It's not the norm. And so every neighborhood has their kind of, you look around and you go, okay, the typical person in this neighborhood looks like this, sounds like this, does these kinds of things. And then you've got the outliers. You've got the people who just are different. Maybe you've got a kind of a business-minded community, but you've got this small little group of artists. Or you've got a community filled with young families, and you've got this other group over here of kind of rebels, and maybe they've got like a goth thing, or they've got a biker thing going on there, and they're just not a part of the mainstream.
Sure.
Well, they need Jesus too. And I love the idea that there are churches that are called to reach people who don't fit into the mainstream of whatever community they find themselves. And that's one of the things I think smaller churches do well. Because once you hit certain size, you can't hit certain sizes unless you are appealing to the mainstream people within your culture, unless you live in a massively populated area like I do, and you can pick almost any subsection of humanity, and you can find tens of thousands of people like that when you live in the greater LA basin like I do. I mean, there's just millions of people everywhere. Sure. But typically, if you're going to be reaching subsections of the culture, then you're going to be doing that through a smaller church. But quite frankly, most of the people who are in subsections, part of the appeal of that is that not everybody is in that. That there's a special bond we share because we like something that most people don't. So I think, and Jesus speaks to all of that. And I think he speaks to it well because, quite frankly, Christianity works best when we're the outsiders and not when we're sitting in the power chair.
I could appreciate that. So what's the difference then between a church that's quirky and a church that's merely trying to be hip and cool?
Oh, great question, because those are worlds apart. You know, I'm 55. I'm a white 55-year-old third generation English as my first language Christian.
Right.
I'm as white bread as it gets. For me to get up and try to be quirky and cool and so on is just sad.
Yeah.
It's not me. And anybody who's got any discernment at all can spot that in a second and will run away from that as fast as they possibly can.
Sure.
Okay? But there are people within my church who come from really different kind of quirky backgrounds who are at the church. And when I've asked them, you know, why are you here? Because your, for lack of a better word, persona doesn't fit kind of the typical way that we do church here. And every single time their answer is the same. It's because you're authentic and you're genuine and you're not trying to be something that you're not.
Right.
So if your persona is mainstream, be mainstream, but be authentic about it and accept those who aren't mainstream. If your persona, if your personality, if your gifting, if your passions are not mainstream, then be that as authentically and genuinely as possible. People are not drawn to quirky, they're drawn to authenticity.
And that in itself will prevent the quirky church from getting weird.
Absolutely.
Being authentic.
Yeah. And of course rooted in Scripture.
Sure.
Because it doesn't work to change the fundamentals of Scripture. That's not quirky, that's heresy.
Right. Well, I went to a church like that before for a short period of time. It was very, very young and hip and mostly college age. And that was kind of the thing was I'm not going to sit here and say they were in heresy or whatnot, but it seemed that their goal was to listen to the community more than to preach the gospel. And so like anybody that came in had an opinion and it didn't matter what their beliefs were, they were accepted, which is okay to a point, but it was almost very like universalist in theory and in theology, which I didn't agree with.
The church needs to allow more questions than we have, and the church needs to listen to more voices than we have. But listening to voices and allowing questions is not the same as saying every opinion carries the same validity, because they don't. There are absolute truths. God exists. I actually believe God exists.
Right. Right.
And if God actually exists, then I can't make him up. I'm not allowed to make up things about him that aren't true any more than you can make up things about me that aren't true. You can't change my name. You can't say I'm a woman when I'm a man. You can't say I live in Texas when I live in California. You're not allowed to do that because I exist. So you have to take me as I am. If God exists, then we have to take him as he is. And our job is not to discover a God to our liking. Our job is to figure out as best we can the God who does exist.
I like that. Now, let me ask you this question. It's a little offbeat, but do you think that church could be a lonely place for some people? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, hugely so. Hugely so. It's because the church makes such lofty claims that we fall farther short of it than most places with their claims, right? If you go to a restaurant and their claim is to have great food, and their food is only average, well, you walk away and you go, no big deal. I don't think I'll go back to that restaurant again. You don't swear off of food.
Right.
Right? Because it's not a lofty claim. It's just great food. We have ridiculously lofty claims. We claim to know absolute truth about the most important things in existence. I mean, right? Well, I don't claim to know it. I claim that God knows it, and then He's revealed it to me.
Sure.
That's a very important distinction.
Right.
I am not claiming that for myself.
Sure.
But I believe there is a God, and that He makes absolute claims about the most important things, and those things begin with love your neighbor as yourself, and that there is absolute truth to be discovered, and that everybody is accepted and loved by a holy and loving God, and that we have broken that covenant with sin, and that the cross is the only way to reconcile ourselves back to God again. I mean, these are not small things. These are monstrously big things, and we will never, ever fully fulfill those. And so people will allow a certain amount of us not reaching that. But when we claim to be loving and are constantly critical, when we claim to have integrity and are constantly lying, well, then they have a right to call us on that. And then, unlike the restaurant, they don't swear off of food forever. There are people who will then say, "Oh, I'm swearing off of God forever because I gave 10 different churches a shot, and every one of them was massively hypocritical."
Right.
I get that feeling. I get why people react that way, because our claims are that high.
So how can the small church be more inclusive to maybe win? I hate using that term "win." Let me rephrase that. But how could the church be inclusive, to the disenfranchised people again?
Again, I think it really comes back to authenticity. If we are open and authentic about, and here's a word I hate, the journey we're on, because the whole idea of a journey, when we talk about it too much, it sounds like we never have a destination in mind. And there is a destination. It's to become like Christ.
Right.
But everybody gets to that place in different ways. Jesus is the only way, but my journey with Jesus is different than your journey with Jesus.
Right.
And if I can be as open and honest as possible about my walk with Christ and about my failings in my walk with Christ, I think there is, again, an authenticity, a genuineness to this that people are drawn to. Plus, it makes them feel like, okay, then I can make mistakes too, and I'm not going to be condemned and shoved aside. I mean, how many people, when they find themselves making the biggest mistakes of their lives and are screwed up royally, their first thought is, I need to go to a church because they'll accept me and love me back again.
Right.
Now, most people run away from church as fast as they can because they feel that's the place they're going to be judged for all of that. That
makes sense.
And we're not going to reach people if we are perceived of as a place primarily of judgment. Does that mean we don't have standards? No, of course not. We have like I said earlier, we claim the highest standards on the face of the earth. But while we're claiming that, again, it goes back to my phrasing earlier. I don't claim that I have that truth. I claim that God has that truth and that He has revealed it to us. So if we can show people our genuine walk with Christ to discover and rediscover and to share those truths as we find them, I think people will be open to people who are genuinely doing that.
Well, I think in this day and age, it's getting more to that. I think we have, you say we have to be more genuine. People, with social media, we have more increased access to one another's lives, and you can tend to see who a person really is. It's harder to put that face on, put that mask on with social media. So,
yeah, very true.
Right. So definitely need to be more genuine. Couple last things, Karl. Could you talk a little bit about your book, The Grasshopper Myth?
Yeah. Like I said earlier, it was only about 5 years ago that I discovered I was a small church pastor, and it was through a real season of difficulty of wondering if I was really called to ministry because my church was quote-unquote stuck at certain numerical levels. And out of all of that, long story short, I went through some real trauma in debating my calling of ministry until I really realized, you know what? My church is small. I'm a small church pastor. Given the landlocked nature of where we are and the expensiveness of the land around us, which I just recently wrote about on my blog, we're going to be small for a while. So we need to figure out what a healthy small church looks like, and we need to figure out how to do ministry not just in the church, but from the church. And when I started asking those questions, I couldn't find much help. I couldn't find anybody who could define for me what a healthy small church looked like. I couldn't find books or blogs that would give me ideas about healthy small church. So I started just writing it down myself as I tried and made mistakes and asked questions and found answers. I wrote it all down until I had this stack of notes, and I thought I needed to turn it into something. And it became this book. And then I ended up with this crazy title, The Grasshopper Myth. It's not about insects.
Yeah, where does that context come from?
Yeah, it's from Numbers 13, where the spies come back from looking at the promised land, and 10 of them say, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them, because there were giants in the land. And they looked like grasshoppers to themselves first. They saw a grasshopper in the mirror. Eleanor Roosevelt is credited with saying, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent.
Sure.
And when we see a grasshopper in the mirror, we give that consent to others to make us feel inferior. So when I used to hear stories of, a church growing and exploding and reaching people for Jesus, I'll admit today I wasn't grateful for the people saved as much as I was angry that God wasn't doing that with me.
Mm-hmm.
I was that toxic. My spirit was that dangerous that I wasn't even celebrating the salvations. And it was because of the grasshopper in the mirror. And so I had to redefine it. I'm not a grasshopper. Small is not wrong. Small is not broken. Small is not bad. We can do great things in small churches. And if you just look at the numbers, half of the Christians in the world, 1 billion Christians attend churches under 250 people. They're not doing that by mistake. And God isn't putting all those small churches in the world by mistake. I think
it works, obviously.
What's that?
That small church model seems to work.
Yeah, it's been working for 2,000 years.
Sure.
And like I said earlier, in the places in the world where believers are actually increasing as a percentage of the population, it's almost exclusively by the multiplication of small churches. Mm-hmm. The typical small church, Ed Stetzer did some research on this a while ago and published it, I think, at Christianity Today, where I also blog. And he said the typical small church baptizes more new believers, sends more people out into the mission field, and plants more churches per person than a megachurch does. So 10,000 people in one megachurch will have fewer salvations, fewer water baptisms, fewer people sent into ministry, and will plant fewer churches than 10,000 people in 100 small churches. Now, that's not bad on the big church. They do other things really well, too.
Right.
But every size has value.
All right, so best place for people to get more information and to read your blogs is at newsmallchurch.com. That's correct?
Yeah, newsmallchurch.com is my website, and then most of my posts are previewed there, and then you click to read the entire part of them at christianitytoday.com/Karl Vaters. But simply because 9 out of 10 people are going to misspell my name and not find that blog,
sure.
It's best to start at newsmallchurch.com because you can't misspell that one. And then you can follow me at Karl Vaters on Twitter or at New Small Church on Facebook as well.
Super. Well, Karl, I'll put all those links up on neverforsakenpodcast.com when we get the podcast up. And I think the work that you're doing is great. Sorry that it took you a while to come to that realization, that what you were doing was an excellent thing. I was really refreshed in reading some of your articles because I always had that church growth, mentality in my head as well. And
sure,
I always felt if I wasn't part of a big church, I wasn't part of a good church. And you're kind of helping me to see that that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, if right now through what I'm writing, I'm beginning to discover that my struggle is very common with others. So if sharing my struggle can help others shorten their struggle, then I am glad to have struggled.
It was all worth it then.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, Karl, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and look forward to reading more of your writings and to perhaps speaking with you again one day.
Thanks, John. I'd love to.
All right. Thank you so much.